So the weather this winter has been crazy. I'm really grateful that it's gotten warmer because if you remember earlier this week, it seemed like winter had come to stay. And with all that cold and snow meant that we also got a lot of salt. Salt on the roads, on our cars, and on our shoes. But because of all this salt, it means that we were able to experience today's gospel in a unique way. Jesus says, "But if salt loses its taste, with what can it be seasoned? It is no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." For all the good that salt does in clearing our roads, it gets everywhere. Jesus calls us the salt of the earth. And usually when we hear this, we think of salt as a source of flavor or a preservative, the good things about salt. But there's kind of something extreme, not so nice about salt, even annoying. When we say that food is salty, it's usually not a good thing. It means there's too much salt in it. Or when we say that someone's salty about something, it means that they're upset about that thing. Or if we say that they're salty, it means that they're kind of upset all the time. There's something about salt that's just too much. So when Jesus calls us to be the salt of the earth, I think it means that we all need to embrace our saltiness a little bit more. In our culture, we've all become so afraid of offending people with our Catholicism by being too salty that I fear that we become kind of tasteless. I can't help but remember a memorable scene in the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding. In the movie, a young Greek-American woman, Tula Portokalos, falls in love with an English teacher who's not Greek named Ian Miller. And this shocks her family because she's the first person in generations to fall in love with a not Greek person. And so after her large, colorful Greek family meets Ian's quiet parents, her father Gus laments about how boring they are. So dry. That family is like a piece of toast. No honey, no jam, just dry. And I can't help but fear that that's what has happened to so many Catholics. We've become so afraid of offending people with our faith that we've become bland, like dry white toast. Sure, toast is probably the most inoffensive food there is, but no one's really excited about eating toast. So what's the solution? I think it's time for us to be salty. And salty in a way that's not afraid of offending people. Now, of course, I don't mean being intentionally rude or offensive to people. I simply mean not being afraid to be who we are as Catholics. And G.K. Chesterton has a helpful example for this. He says this: "Suppose we heard an unknown man spoken of by many men. Suppose we were puzzled to hear that some men said he was too tall and some too short. Some objected to his fatness, some lamented his leanness. Some thought him too dark and some too fair. One explanation, as has been already admitted, would be that he might be an odd shape. But there is another explanation. He might be the right shape. Perhaps, in short, this extraordinary thing is really the ordinary. At least the normal thing, the center. Perhaps, after all, it is Christianity that is sane and all its critics who are mad. If it's true that we live in a fallen world, then the world's sense of taste should not be our standard. Just because the world prefers bland food doesn't mean that we need to become dry white toast. If we are the salt of the earth, then we need to help the world recover its sense of taste. It might be too salty at first until their taste buds adjust to the delicious flavor of Christianity. It might burn like salt in a wound, but it only burns so that that wound can be healed. And the salt might get everywhere, but it helps melt the ice so that we can get where we're going. So how do we become salty? In the second reading, Paul talks about how he came to the Corinthians, first by saying what he didn't do. He said that he doesn't come with persuasive words of wisdom. Instead, he tells us, "I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." In the end, this is what makes us the salt of the earth. This is what makes us different from anybody else. Jesus Christ crucified. And notice that Paul doesn't start by saying that he preached Jesus crucified, but rather he knew Jesus Christ crucified. And of course he preached him, but he can only preach him because he knew him first. This call to be the salt of the earth is only possible if we are rooted in a relationship with Jesus Christ and him crucified. But in doing this, we realize that even as our saltiness can burn, so also does the intense flavor of the love of God burn us. Even as we are enveloped by the love of Jesus Christ, we also then see more clearly areas where we need to change. And yet, as we grow in this friendship with Jesus, we find that we want to grow, even if it hurts. And when we view being the salt of the earth from this perspective, it changes everything. We no longer see evangelization as trying to impose our worldview on somebody else. Instead, we see Jesus as such a close friend that we can't help but want to invite other people into that friendship. And yet, even as I say this, we need to be honest. It's not going to feel natural to do this at first. It might even be scary. But once we make that choice to be in an intimate friendship with Jesus Christ, we are also making the choice to invite other people into that friendship. And it might be the leap of going out of ourselves and talking to a stranger about the faith. Or it might be as simple as answering the question of, what church do you go to? But in all of this, we can't be afraid to be the salt of the earth. And I'll be the first person to throw myself under the bus here. A situation for me where I encounter this fear is when I go to get a haircut. And when I get a haircut, it's just not a pleasant experience for me in general because I'm shy and it's an extended period of time of talking to a stranger. And usually when I get my haircut, I don't go dressed like this, in case you're wondering. And for the most part, even though I'm not dressed like this, I don't mind talking about being a seminarian. But more often than I like to admit, there are times where I sincerely hope that we can spend the whole time just talking about the weather. And one time I remember a haircut where the hairstylist asked me what I did for a living. And so I said, a student. And I thought I dodged a bullet. But as the conversation went on, the stylist asked me how things were at the seminary. Even though I hadn't mentioned it, she knew exactly where I was from. And what was I afraid of? I could say offending her, but honestly, it was more selfish than that. I didn't feel like having someone look at me differently. I didn't feel like having someone throw a billion questions or objections about the faith at me when all I wanted to do was to get my hair cut. But it's like Jesus says, a city set on a mountain cannot be hidden. Even if we try to hide our faith, often it still shines through whether we want it to or not. Maybe you're thinking, it's great for somebody who's studying to be a priest. You really can't avoid being salty or being noticed when you're a priest or a nun. And yet I have some surprising news for you. The church, in some ways, has an even greater responsibility for those who aren't priests or nuns, the lay people. In Vatican II, it says, the laity consecrate the world itself to God. The laity consecrate the world itself to God. So how do they do that? Basically, they do it by living out their daily lives as fathers, mothers, students, business people, teachers, doctors, maintenance people, the list goes on. But in doing all this, they offer it to Jesus. By living and working in the world, they have a unique opportunity to witness to the faith, both by their words and by their actions. And in some way, this witness culminates in the Mass, and especially in the part of the Mass called the offertory, where the bread and the wine are prepared to be offered to Jesus, to the Father in the Eucharist. And in this moment today, I invite you to take all the joys and sorrows, the challenges of your daily life, and to put those, in addition to yourself, onto the paten or into the chalice so that it can be offered along with the bread and wine to God the Father. Then, as we receive Jesus in the Eucharist, we will leave this place and go out into the world. We will literally carry the presence of Jesus within us. So as we receive Jesus in the Eucharist today, let's allow him to fill us with the taste of his love, a love that can burn, but only burns so that it can heal. Jesus calls us to be the salt of the earth. So let's not be afraid to be salty.